Okay, yeah, I kind of like want to talk about certain factors about, I was referring to a Stargate program, and that I really didn't even consider anything about it being a Stargate program until after the fact of realizing that memory had been a pretty huge thing about a lot of issues that had taken place while I was asleep and gas fumigated and actually operated on and taken to various places around the world going through a circuit. Um, Ultimately, I kind of had mentioned that, I don't know if I'd be able to, based upon, like some idea of a photographic memory of some incoherence, even beyond like the incoherence that would represent a newborn child's probably memory, based upon not having a concept of, what language. Only photographic memory would be the memory of knowing the language. In my case, it's English, okay? The thing with this is that going through it seemed to be that realizing that I'd been operated on and actually realizing that for approximately 4 inches of my humerus bone on both sides of my arm in between my shoulder and elbow had been removed, and I didn't even realize that I'd been operated on. And it seemed to be something about the Led Zeppelin song. I don't know, there for a while it's like seeing a whole bunch of women and models looking at their shoulders, and it became like really, really noticeable about that. And it seemed to be almost like a Led Zeppelin song, what is and what should never be. Yeah, so it seemed to be something about the what should and should never be. It seemed to be about the 23, the W about the shoulder, the should and shoulder. And it seemed to be that particular song and in the alphanumeric should never be been 701 in Paraline, and it seemed to be that the way alphanumeric linguistics had taken place, it seemed to be that that had been some idea of a location, one of the songs that was actually used in the Tom Cruise movie Oblivion, and it's in the valley, right at a waterfront, another location that's actually taken to, and it seemed to be like almost kind of like a dream theater, like album cover, the way it's almost like a teleprompting speed reader, tunnel vision, yet it's like what would look like a strip, like a fortune cookie, but the way that the eyes, like the line would be like, I don't know if many people would remember like speed reading, like a teleprompting tunnel vision type of reading comprehension, as like a teleprompting speeding speed reader type of situation with like only the letters like in a tunnel vision being lit while chronologically moving from left to right. It's kind of like the impression I have of, I think it's like the Octavarian CD of like a dream theater, yeah. So like something about that in that building in the valley, because there's another band that sings that song Valley of the Kings, and it seemed to be the thing about involving certain types of lasers in that one particular song, and some similarities of around this area. So like in any case, so like I come to the realization that had taken place, and like I said, that when memory became the issue was like really after the fact. They're going through some period of 1994, 95, and 96. And a bunch of information that seemed to be given the indication of the World Trade Center from 95 to 2001, the difference is 6. And a considerable amount of the alphanumerics of 52 and the numeric value of 6 itself, and involving a 6-year period between like 1995. And it seemed to be that song with Earth, Wind, and Fire of September. Do you remember Never Was a Cloudy Day? And it seemed to be that seemed to be really more so about the September 9/11, about that, and actually being taken to different places during some sort of subconscious minus chase of 36 being, WadeASVPriddy International or Electronic Power, Selective Service, and it seemed to be pretty much the intense part about it. The thing with it is that certain factors involving toxicology seem to be an issue that maybe presented the wheezing of like what would be used during a type of bag that actually treats and supports the inner lining of the lungs during a chemical burn to actually keep the lungs from collapsing. And it seemed to be like, I had mentioned like several times before that procedures that were like being presented became like a created manufactured type of situation, actually controlling whether or not if Access had presented the mandatory requirements. And the thing with this is that the way it had all happened, it seemed to be, looking like I was willingly, knowingly, and participating with every single thing about it. Really, truthfully so, truthfully not. The thing with this is that certain types of medication that had been presented had actually created what is more so of the symptom. It was being treated as a symptom, not a causation. And when actually medication actually was creating congestion, and it ultimately resulted in calls to 911 for about a 16 to an 18-month period, okay? The 15th month was the only month that I didn't have to go to ER, okay? And the thing with this is that medication that was actually being prescribed, it got to the point of what Access has meant, like in his home. And, I don't know what the deal is about being on YouTube, okay? But really, it's kind of like getting serious about being on YouTube with my lighting, like you're seeing like on me now and behind me inside this tent in my own home, okay? The thing with this is that, I mentioned certain types of like lifespan of intellectual during what seemed to be ultimately it seems like quite a bit of this is actually getting to a world class, for real, and it seemed to be that even recognizing it had been, the thought of like had ultimately got to, even a baptism. And I say this and I stress this one particular thing because it seemed to be really that ultimately during the 6th, 7th, and 8th grade was predominantly stressing certain types of color codes of like world history. Predominantly it seemed the thing to be of night vision. Pastel green being of province. It's predominantly that, and there's a pastel red. I actually have to think about it, but the thing with this is that during that time it's been the celebration of 1976 is 200-year celebration of America and the bicentennial quarter and all that information, and I mentioned that that students were holding their hands around the flagpole, okay, and praying around the flagpole, and I think that's actually I think it was only 2 years of the 3 years from 6th, 7th, and 8th grade. I'm actually trying to place my memory, but I'm thinking there's something about it only being a 2-year thing of the 3 when I was there anyway. But ultimately it seemed to be really ultimately getting to a Six Flag baptism involving Friendswood, Texas in Galveston County, okay? And all the alphanumerics that associate the 213 and the Z71 and all that information. But ultimately it had got to severing some idea as a forecast and what had actually taken place when I was going through the circuit from like really a 10 that took really more than 16. And the more that I think about it, it seemed to be like considerable amount, even before, during, and after. But it was only during and after the fact of like from 1994, 95, and 96, and it really extremely intense, like a 6 to 9 month period. It seemed to be that possibly even a whole entire year had passed. And it's like before I had mentioned, it seemed like I'd heard that phrase, I had a schedule, and I was thinking, how could all that had happened and like wake up and it seemed to be like just the next day, and then I'd actually had got to the point that I'd heard it so many times that I had a schedule, and was realizing considerable amount about like television and how phenomenally huge that kind of secret would actually really seriously be, including all that information about the World Trade Center and the 6-year difference between like 1995 and 2001. It was like in my perception of the 1992 presidential inaugural ball that there was actually identical locations at different locations looking exactly identical going on, and looking like it was like I don't know if I would really use the simulcast thing, but it seemed to be that whether it be pre-recorded, it all seemed live to me, but I had enough experience of like, you know, identical identity in genetics, you know, coming through Pearland really, and realizing, I mean, before I even realized it, that had been really an issue. And it seemed to be something about that in the 1992 presidential inaugural ball that was like at different locations. I mean, during a live thing about it, of identical identity, having the same clothes, virtually everything. And I'm not real sure if everything about it was live. But in any case, so I mean, that seemed to be like really an issue, whether or not if that's the issue really of the World Trade Center. And you know, the thing about, I had a schedule that presented, you know, different locations, and it seemed to be that from 1995 to like 2001, it's just really only of my concern like right now. But the thing with this is that this is the year 2025, okay? And you know, they showed different versions of the World Trade Center, and it had presented like footage that had given different times and locations. In any case, so like my point is that it wasn't until after the fact of like a memory of like screensaver reactivated and rejuvenated the thought that memory had been the issue, and I had a schedule had been, how could that have happened, and only seemed to be like, you know, just the next day. You know, because for a 6 to 9 month period, maybe even in an entire year, it seemed to be that some real serious issues had taken place, and I actually had realized that I'd been operated on, in like 4 inches, approximately 4 inches of my bone, my humerus bone had been removed. The thing with this is that, thinking about, you know, the birth certificate and all that, and at the time a newborn child having their footprint put on the birth certificate, that the humerus bone is approximately about 4 inches at that time, and it got to the point of like biometrics being the issue of like a carbon footprint, like biometrics being part of about a carbon footprint. And the thing with this is that, you know, a carbon footprint would only suggest that, you know, chronological consistent, a timeline would obviously be the issue of a forecast or a projected estimate. And you know, I sit there and thought about it for quite some time, and it seemed to be that it had taken place, and likewise it seemed to be something about the you know, an apparatus that had been seemingly, there's like wheezing in my chest, and not even realizing that potentially my lung had been lined with a bag that was like presented when I was going through ER, like for like a 16-month period, and not only the 15th month I didn't have to go, but it was continually, as it progressed after the year 2020 to 2022, with me being on YouTube, on my YouTube.com channel, WadeASVPriddy, P-R-I-D-D-Y, YouTube.com, you know, with the sliding like you're seeing like on me now and behind me, not limited to, you know, me playing my drums and presenting, you know, my idea as a standard, you know, as a drummer, really a singer as well. But the thing with it is that progressively, you know, there had been some issues that presented access and you know, air quality, and ultimately, you know, it got to the point of what's going on in the hospital, because it seemed to be, you know, that the entire network and the whole entire Houston area is involving, you know, the additives versus the additives, preservatives, and byproducts, and it seemed to be that really ultimately an entire life of like, you know, eating FDA approved, consuming food that had been identified as having additives, preservatives, and byproducts, and realizing that at the beginning of George W. Bush's administration, that's when I realized that I hadn't seen any. I hadn't even looked here lately, I mean, at all. I mean, even at the food and drink that I'm drinking it now. But I mean, I'm referring to back then, I mean, it's kind of like and you know, I'm probably going to start like looking to see if it's even like on it, like, but it seemed to be that the additives, preservatives, and byproducts had only got to the idea of like Europe's most wealthiest museum being, you know, like a museum for like dead people, and And it's almost like the additives, preservatives, and byproducts, you know, that would be used for like some idea, you know, like preserving, you know, the human body as a museum for like dead people. Okay. Well, in any case, so like I hadn't seen it, and it's kind of like the accusation of the century. You know, it's like where'd all the additives, preservatives, and byproducts go? But anyways, after the fact, I'm not realizing I had backtracked, you know, 5 or 6 years. So when I actually noticed I've not seen that, and actually something like that happening, and actually taking to that museum, Europe's most wealthiest museum, and realizing for the first time on a Microsoft screensaver, presenting it over a period of years, and realized that that was like when I knew for the first time that memory had become an issue, and slowly, progressively, more and more referring to everything as a Stargate program, then the Abraham Lincoln Night Vision Shadow Government Stargate program. I mean, after the fact, probably 25 to 30 years, I mean, after, predominantly, you know, the most intense, that was, like, you know, 1994, 95, and 96. I'm not limited to it, but the thing with this is that, that had taken place, and other factors that seemed to be that controlling the, my blood flow had ultimately got to, you know, after being on YouTube for like 2 years, from like 2020 to 2022, really longer, but progressively, similarly, the air quality and contaminants like on my clothes, my music equipment, in my food, and on my clothes, my bed, had got to the point of, you know, I mean, immediately, like, I'm looking like the entire situation all around me, okay? You know, making calls to the mayor's office and city manager, and, you know, everything about, you know, calling, until the point that it got to that, even making calls to, you know, but ultimately it resulted, you know, progressively, from 2020 to 2022, after being on YouTube for like 2 years, is progressively, like, all this stuff had taken place, and me having actually moved from room to room in this home right here. Actually, I'm on SSI, Supplemental Security Income, okay? And you know, realizing almost immediately, I mean, you know, it'd be, you know, like when and wherever, you know, leaving would be like, I mean, the same thing anywhere I'd win anyway. So like, anyway, so it became an issue of, like, you know, calling and getting, I hadn't received not like one call or acknowledging any factors of any claim of the city of Pearland actually being presented some of the information that this had been annexed. This section here in Pearland, County Road 107, okay, and certain information, and when all this stuff started taking place, I'd actually called and was referring to easements, access. It got to the point of even like trading energy, and the Centerpoint smart meter becoming an issue of Region 0. And Texas and New Mexico Power had, you know, kind of put themselves into the picture, and ultimately got that Centerpoint energy had been like, you know, some idea of like some like frequency being measured, you know, a cycle per second, and at a 90-degree it would look like, you know, like a circle to dot, like Centerpoint, okay, or the euro dollar thing about it. In any case, so like all that was like going on, and it stated that Centerpoint energy, the smart meter, had been, you know, some idea of the North American Free Trade Act, and, you know, energy trading, and all this stuff going on in political reference. I mean, I'm on supplemental security income, okay? I'm kind of like, not necessarily, I mean, you know, it's not, you know, exactly hard to believe anything that I've been talking about on YouTube.com at WadeASVPriddy, PIDDY, YouTube.com, involving, you know, immigration, customs enforcement, vice president network, or, you know, importing and exporting in a way of like a 200-mile of protected waters around the United States, as compared to a Kingsman ship representing some idea of a moat. Or, you know, the idea of the English Parliament representing, you know, some idea of like, you know, what's on par. I mean, ultimately it's getting to whether or not if appreciation or depreciation, it's just a 9-hole golf course representing some idea of appreciation or depreciation, or, you know, some idea of like loss prevention as suppression of monetary and domestic. Yet, you know, some idea that if it's even true that on the separate from what I see is to be the settlement side of litigation, de facto writ of habeas corpus, more so like suppression of loss prevention of the monetary and domestic aggregates, as compared to what I see as like the annuity side of like, commercial venues of living quarter as obstruction of justice. The way terminology is actually used and presented on television, it's close and similar, but it seemed to be more so that obstruction of justice is more so on the side of the annuity side as compared to some idea of settlement involving deed restrictions in television programming. And the thing of it is that, all this has taken place and progressively over years of like, really getting into like linguistic and alphanumerics and everything that's been involved in international financial management and just like, glancing, just looking for, one word, through, all kinds of alphanumerics and linguistic, embedded, beyond the concept, not limited to the process of elimination or anything other than, looking at the television as a circuit, and like I'm like looking right at it, but going through a circuit and realizing a little bit, about deed restriction more and more, about television programming, or what the real issue is with national security, or anything that would reflect, the antisocial, so take action now, if there's too much action in the discotheque, yeah. So like anyway, obviously taking place, it's like on YouTube, like with my drums, with like a Prohibition VSX in a Strata red with like black hardware, okay? It's like a 35 piece with all the hardware and, special effects, rotos and, and octobans and the hi-hat tambourines and, all that stuff and special effects bells and cymbals and all that. So like, and once again, like I'm working on getting the Prohibition VSX in a Strata blue, and hopefully it won't be an issue, like getting real serious, like blue chromium beyond any idea and not flashing, at all. Which had been really an issue, and it seemed to be that even maintaining some idea, because I've made calls, even to the city of Pearland, the mayor's office, and even Washington D.C. and the White House, and start talk about like carbon footprints, vice president networks, and some idea of like litigation, de facto risk of habeas corpus in between, the idea of the exclusionary rule provision, presenting some idea of like executive powers, sovereign immunities, and governmental amnesties, somewhere between like Wyatt Earp and John Wayne, and litigation de facto risk of habeas corpus, and some idea of like American intelligence that would reflect some idea of like being baptized during the gold rush and on the Wells Fargo stagecoach and all that McDonald's golden arches and all that about 1 cycle per second and oscillation, 1 cycle per second being measured in oscillation, and the practical application of McDonald's being side by side, that 1 cycle becoming side by side like the electronic schematic fish, a symbol of Christian, to me it's beyond the thought and concept of a religion. It's more like more so on the Christian Science side. And as far as I can see, some idea of like a 1 cycle per second being side by side, being some idea of like relations, some fertility, some affirmative fallopian tube representative of misappropriation allocation of the Mississippi, and between some idea of like the architecture platform and embedded encryption and all that stuff, and the heartbeat of America and all that good stuff that seemed to be some idea beyond religion that would represent maybe the naivety of not knowing anything about alphanumerics, or Americans being 64 and HTTP and like Israel, and it's still English to me anyway. But it seemed to be really that the Mormon Church is known as like an American religion, and it seemed to be like even now it's kind of like presenting the issue like a birth certificate being some idea of like whether or not if maintaining control of a birth certificate over a footprint being some idea of like a carbon footprint and a timeline that represent biometrics, or citizen birthrights, or the thing about yeah, going beyond like not a question of what citizenship and birthright is to like being an American or realizing some idea between a degree as compared to non-degree. And all the stuff is like going on, and like now I'm in a tent in my own home. This is the cathedral part of my home where my drums are, which is actually they're like not there because I actually sold them because of some idea of like a retroactive future. It seemed to be, it was like so like retroactive and like not available in the United States at the time. The Prohibition VSX was like not even available, but it was like in my home. I was brought back to my home during Stargate program. I didn't even know I was like in my own home. Okay, actually bought the same drum set, even the same furniture, and realizing that economics had like made some idea of like availability, and me realizing that a bunch of I don't like calling it demographics. It's just that the idea of a controlled situation involving an economic factor such as like being on supplemental security income and what availability only means, and realizing something had been so manufactured and created, and like realizing I actually purchased the same drum set and the same furniture that was in my home that was not in my home when I was going through the circuit, and then brought back here, then it was here, then when I got back it wasn't here, didn't remember a thing about it. I was brought back here, and I'm waking up in the middle of the night in the dark in my own home. I didn't even know where I was at, and when I'm opening up my eyes, I'm looking at a drum set and it didn't even compute. Language was not even computing, but I was like staring at the drum set, and it was probably about 30 to 45 minutes before I was even grasping, language, like what am I looking at, And then it's like the drum set, okay, and years later, okay, this is like during 1995. It seemed to be like, like places all around the entire world at different locations. Excuse me. Yeah, so like, and realizing that like something like a retroactive projected estimate option in future had been involving like economics and importing and exporting here in Pearland, Texas, in my own home, and realized after I was on YouTube that I actually purchased it, and it was the same Prohibition VSX in a Strata Red with the black hardware that wasn't even available, like, to my knowledge, anywhere in the United States, even more specifically, Pearland, Texas, and Houston, Texas. It was in my home, and wasn't even available, after, a specific time, after 1995, predominantly even around, year 2000. I didn't notice it and see it anywhere, really. It was probably about the year about 2018, 2019, when I actually purchased the drum set. I'd actually purchased it and as a 5-piece and went into making special purchases that ultimately wound up being like 35 pieces, including the drum throne, the seat, and all the hardware. Excuse me. So like and placed it in the same place, which would have been automatically normal anyway. But the furniture, the sofa, the recliners, and then realizing after I'd been on YouTube for about a year and a half, and realized that I'd purchased it and that all this was in my home, and didn't remember, not one thing about it. Even this tent, although it's like lined with like silver now, it was actually like white during 1995. Like even the tent was in here. I had been like moving from bedroom to bedroom, trying to avoid contaminants on my bed, on my clothes, in the washer, the dryer, in my food, in the refrigerator. I made calls, and it got to the point that making a call to like anyone, it was like ridiculous. So beyond like not cool. It resulted in like calls to like 911 for like the admitting diagnosis being like congestive heart failure over like contaminants. I knew immediately, that it was like, really what the Consumer Report Price Index would only mean is some idea, and all this had been taking place, and and it seemed to be like even trade and energy had involved the idea of like North American Free Trade Act, and ultimately even some idea of like NATO, the North Atlantic Treaties Organization, or the North Atlantic Peace Treaties Organization, and it ultimately got to the idea of like energy had been being traded some idea like center point energy and the Maxwell Smart. So get Maxwell Smart has ultimately, what it's like now. My situation now seems to be, a region 1 and a region 0 issue like center point energy. So I had those like removed like a year and a half ago. This is the year 2025, and I haven't had electricity from center point energy or billed by Reliant and it got to the point that I wouldn't even put up with talking like anything about anyone like at Reliant Energy or Centerpoint. And hopefully I had them come out and remove the smart meters for Centerpoint. And now kind of like I'm waiting the thing for like a Texas New Mexico Power. And seem to be thinking about Texas City, Texas is really where I want Texas New Mexico Power. Some idea that Texas City, Texas will really put the Texas City, Texas, and so get Maxwell Smart, or even the idea of like the Smart for two, the smart car, and going beyond the Scion IQ and the Saturn Sky and the Lexus LFSA, and the Chuck Woolery 2 be back in 2 and 2 thing about it, and it seemed to be really even involving Texas and Mexico Power that way, and the Roosevelt New Deal Act, because it seemed to be the thing about Univision and their pastels, the 3 pastels in the black in the beginning and 3 pastels in white. Somewhere in between, those pastels representing some idea of the history of the television screen in monochrome, going through some idea of the conversion of like analog to digital. And it seemed to be like an overlapping issue that reflects placement of like even the grayscale on the Houston Astros uniform, representing some idea of like paper mate in the way of like what is normally a standard of 10 different shades of the grayscale. Yet it seems to be presenting the alphanumerics of like paper mate being 56:10 on the Houston Astros there in like the Nolan Ryan. And some similarities in relation of like the grayscale being used even on the Diners Club, including the font size. It seemed to be like the thing about excuse me, Diners Club, about the font size and I think it was 5 shades of the grayscale of the blue transitioning into like the midnight blue, and I'm not sure if it's like considered anything beyond midnight blue, maybe black, but I'm thinking it was just like 5 shades. And that circle with a line in it seemed to be the big deal, in my mind, applied to that symbolic representation between the C and the PTI, so representing, like a 90 degree of like a center line, and the quadrants, and even the center point energy and the center point of like 1 cycle per second and oscillation being measured, and